Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Oh, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. So we will be starting. This hadith, inshallah, is extremely important simply because a lot of Muslims are very hesitant, or let me say, very afraid to speak about these matters, and specifically when we're talking about social justice and the laws that relate to it and governing in the time of the West and a postmodern West is right now speaking as the paradigm, as if the rules and the laws are the paradigm to go back to, and the paradigm to judge every other culture to see if they support human rights, they support freedom, and support civilization. And many Muslims are really afraid to speak and support Islam because knowing that some hadith, such as this one, are actually mentioned in Islam. So they start losing their confidence when they speak of these matters, and we're going to actually mention a number of things relating to it. So the hadith first, we're going to talk about that social justice later on. So the hadith says, عن عبد الله بن مسعود عن عبد الله عن ابن مسعود رضي الله عنه قال قال رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم لا يحل دم امرئ مسلم إلا بإحدى ثلاث: الثيب الزاني والنفس بالنفس والتارك لدينه المفارق للجماعة. رواه البخاري ومسلم. I'm going to read the hadith again so that we can comment on every single part of it and also comment on the things that I had mentioned. عن ابن مسعود رضي الله عنه قال قال رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم لا يحل دم امرئ مسلم إلا بإحدى ثلاث: الثيب الزاني والنفس بالنفس والتارك لدينه المفارق للجماعة. رواه البخاري ومسلم. I'm going to translate the hadith literally first. So the hadith says that عن ابن مسعود, Abdullah ibn Mas'ud says that the Prophet ﷺ had said, it is not permissible to damu mri'in muslimin, so dam, which means the blood, anybody to transgress the limit relating to a Muslim blood unless for three reasons. one of the three reasons. الثيب الزاني, an adulterer that has committed sorry about that, but an adulterer or a married adulterer, or somebody that was married before that had committed adultery. In that situation, then they would have, sorry about that, let me just fix the screens a little bit. A thayyib zani is basically a person. A thayyib is anybody that had a previous marriage relationship. So if they had a previous marriage relationship, that means that they are thayyib. They are thayyib. Whether they are in a marriage right now or not, that's not what will make a difference. They had a marriage relationship. Even if they are divorced right now, they are still considered thayyib. And if they are to commit adultery, then in that situation, there is a specific punishment for them. We'll speak about it in just a bit. وَالنَّفْسُ بِالنَّفْسِ. And nafs, the word nafs here, there are different meanings for nafs. So nafs can basically mean the inner feelings, but here in the context, it's actually talking about somebody's life. So if somebody is caught killing somebody, then for that crime of killing somebody, then they have put a sentence on themselves that they too will be sentenced to death. والتارك لدينه المفارق للجماعة. والتارك لدينه, التارك means the person that leaves the religion, leaving the group. What group? We're talking about the Muslim group. In other words, somebody leaving Islam. رواه البخاري ومسلم. It is narrated by Bukhari and Muslim. Let me make a further explanation here, because a number of things. When we talk about Abdullah ibn Mas'ud, there are certain things that we have to say about Abdullah ibn Mas'ud. Number one is that Abdullah ibn Mas'ud is basically Abu Abdul Rahman, Abdullah ibn Mas'ud al-Hudhali. Abdullah ibn Mas'ud, his nickname was Abu Abdul Rahman. Abdullah ibn Mas'ud was one of those Sahaba that had become Muslim in the earliest times, in the very earliest times of Islam. In fact, he was one of the first 4 or the first 6 that had become Muslim. He died in 32-year Hijrah. Abdullah ibn Mas'ud, there was a story of how he became Muslim. The story goes as follows. Abdullah ibn Mas'ud was at the time a shepherd. He was a shepherd for somebody from Quraysh. The Prophet ﷺ and Abu Bakr as-Siddiq were running away from the oppression that was taking place in Mecca at the time. So they were fleeing something. They see Abdullah ibn Mas'ud along with the sheep that he was minding. So the Prophet ﷺ and Abu Bakr as-Siddiq asked him for some milk. But he refused and said that the sheep don't belong to him. So Abdullah ibn Mas'ud, Abu Bakr as-Siddiq, basically tells the Prophet ﷺ that the sheep are not for him. The Prophet ﷺ says, well, give me a sheep that was not impregnated, meaning it didn't get pregnant, or it doesn't have a child and is not feeding a baby sheep. So he brought him one, and then the Prophet ﷺ wiped on its back and wiped on its milk glands and made dhikr. All of a sudden, Abdullah ibn Mas'ud says that they puff with milk. The Prophet ﷺ milks it. Abdullah ibn Mas'ud, observing this, says, teach me how to do that. So the Prophet ﷺ tells him that you are a learned one. In other words, you have that enthusiasm to learn, and the Prophet ﷺ made a dua for him to be a learned one and to be one of those that will be the ulama. And later Abdullah ibn Mas'ud becomes Muslim, And then Abdullah ibn Mas'ud becomes one of the most important Sahaba. Abdullah ibn Mas'ud was not as many would imagine him. Abdullah ibn Mas'ud was a very short man, very dark complexion, very skinny as well. So we're looking at very Yemeni appearance, and we're short, skinny, very small build up. Even the bones were small, the bones were skinny, and that's why the Prophet ﷺ, in one of the instances, the Sahaba even, when in one of the instances Abdullah ibn Mas'ud was climbing up a tree and he fell off the tree, but the Prophet ﷺ realized that they started laughing at him. Why? Because they started laughing at his very thin bones, very small body build-up. So the Prophet ﷺ told them that this man that they are laughing about is basically going to be the man where his own bone, even his saq, even his leg is even heavier than the mountain of Uhud. Abdullah ibn Mas'ud later becomes the Sahabi that was going to be writing the Quran as well, and one of the Sahaba that were called Kuttab al-Wahi, those that were writing the words directly from the Prophet ﷺ, the words of the Quran that were revealed unto the Prophet ﷺ. He would be the one from Kuttab al-Wahi. Abdullah ibn Mas'ud later he migrated to Abyssinia and later to Al-Madinah. And in fact, Abdullah ibn Mas'ud was one of the people that prayed to Al-Quds when it was the Qibla, and later was also one of the people, of course, that prayed towards Mecca. And he was the first to announce the Quran in Mecca when everybody was afraid. Abdullah ibn Mas'ud, despite his small body build-up, so courageous. And this is really important, especially in the West, when we're talking about courage. Not many men and women are taught these meanings: courage, adab, akhlaq, all these different manners. They're not usually taught, and even if it is a subject, it's usually spoken about as if it was just a marginal side of ilm, but it is actually very important to teach these things. What is shaja'a? What is courage? Courage is, instead of having your focus be focused and so centered around fear, you're centered around another thing. You're learning how to bring about the focus to be on the benefit. If I were to take the courage, the principle, the behavior, the determination to do what is right. Now, when we talk about shaja'a, when we're talking about courage, we're talking about sabr, we're talking about patience, we're talking about azima, we're talking about the courage to come forward, to look and focus your eye on a positive thing rather than on the negative side of it, and to focus on the positive side, which is how to bring and make the benefit thing come forward, and how to do all the determination, all the power, whatever it takes to get to the fruit of something, even if there might be some fear or weakness that you might have. You're learning how to have the sabr, that you're holding on to that feeling of fear, and instead of it overcoming you, you're overcoming the feeling of fear and putting in the determination to get to the right thing. And the difference between between shaja'a, between courage, and between it-tahawwur, which is when a person acts in a way where they're putting in all the power, and for something that doesn't have any benefit to it. That would be the tahawwur. That would be when the person is not acting wisely. So when we look at the courage that Abdullah ibn Mas'ud, we usually think of courage as muscular, six-pack, but that's not necessarily relating to courage. Somebody can have the body build up and not have the courage, because courage is on the inside. Courage is an akhlaq on the inside, and that's what Abdullah ibn Mas'ud had. Abdullah ibn Mas'ud, despite his small body build-up, he was the first to stand up in the middle of Mecca and actually read the verses of the Quran and read from Surah Al-Rahman, I believe it is. And Abdullah ibn Mas'ud later becomes the Qadi, later becomes the judge in Al-Kufa, in Iraq, and later becomes the treasurer during the time of Umar ibn al-Khattab and part of the Khilafah during Uthman bin Affan. Abdullah ibn Mas'ud, a lot to say about Abdullah ibn Mas'ud, but it's really important to see how these young men, Abdullah ibn Mas'ud was only a teenager at the time, but Abdullah ibn Mas'ud was one of those Sahaba that took it upon themselves to do whatever it takes, despite their weak body build up, whatever it takes in order to announce Allahu Akbar everywhere. And despite the different circumstances, Abdullah ibn Mas'ud was one of those that had become Muslim before even Dar al-Arqam. When Dar al-Arqam was this first place for any Sahabi to find any location to head to in order to get the ilm of Islam, Abdullah ibn Mas'ud was one of those Sahaba. Even when there was no location, when there was no center to go to in order to get the ilm, Abdullah ibn Mas'ud was one of those Sahaba that didn't care about the circumstances, didn't care about fame, didn't care about having a center, didn't care about having a support, was one of those that was going to be the leader to bring about Islam. There were different opinions on whether he is the fourth to become Muslim, whether the sixth, or even whether he was the 22nd to become Muslim, but he was just a shepherd for Uqba ibn Abi Mu'ayt, and later Abdullah ibn Mas'ud was going to be that main person to teach Islam even to others. In fact, he is the main Qari, he is the main Quran reciter during the time of the Prophet ﷺ, and even after the time of the Prophet ﷺ. Abdullah ibn Mas'ud actually immigrated along with the other Sahaba to Abyssinia and even Medina, and him and his own mother were always serving the Prophet ﷺ. And Abdullah ibn Mas'ud was actually the one to even put on the shoes for the Prophet ﷺ. Ya Allah, imagine putting the Prophet ﷺ's shoes on, and he would even be the person to carry his stick and walk in front of him. Why walk in front of him? That way, if any danger comes forward, he will be there. He will be there to protect the Prophet ﷺ before any danger would come forward. And every single session, he would be there to sit, and he would even be there to slip off the shoes off the Prophet ﷺ's feet. And Abdullah ibn Mas'ud would be the one to always even enter the homes of the Prophet ﷺ when the Prophet ﷺ was there. And Abdullah ibn Mas'ud was one of the most important Sahaba next to around the Prophet ﷺ, and he would be the one to carry his shoes, to even carry the water that he would make wudu from. So if you really wanted ilm al-Islam, you're gonna go to Abdullah ibn Mas'ud. Not to mention that he was even a judge. And Abdullah ibn Mas'ud, after the death of the Prophet ﷺ, he participated in the Fath, in the main victory in Bilad al-Sham, in the Levant, and he was even there during the battle of Yarmouk. And Abdullah ibn Mas'ud chose after that to stay living in Hims in Syria until Umar ibn al-Khattab actually ordered him to move to Al-Kufa in Iraq in order to teach people their religion. The Madhab Hanafi is actually based on Abdullah ibn Mas'ud. This is really important to say. Madhab Hanafi is based on Abdullah ibn Mas'ud, and Abdullah ibn Mas'ud was going to be that other person that was going to be supporting Ammar ibn Yasir and teach the people their Islam. Abdullah ibn Mas'ud, yes, later Uthman bin Affan, what should we call it, laid off Abdullah ibn Mas'ud from his position and ordered him to go back to Medina, and there Abdullah ibn Mas'ud actually stays in Medina when he actually was pricked with a major illness and dies in 32-year Hijrah when he was 60-something years old, and he was buried in Al-Baqi' during the night next to the grave of Uthman ibn Mad'un, after Abdullah ibn Zubayr ibn al-Awwam actually prays on him Salat al-Janazah. Abdullah ibn Mas'ud did not leave a lot of wealth behind. He didn't leave a lot of wealth behind, and it was 90,000 dirham. And but there wasn't the most important part that he left behind is basically the ilm that he had left. And later Abdullah ibn Mas'ud becomes the most important scholar to actually send or deliver the Quran onto the rest of the Muslims. Abdullah ibn Mas'ud narrated this hadith. All right. What is it saying? لا يحل دم امرئ مسلم إلا بإحدى ثلاث. That there are only three things. Now, keep in mind that when we're talking about transgressing, or when we're considering somebody's sacred life, anybody's life is supposed to be sacred, but the only reasons that as a government, the only reasons when they would have the right to transgress the sacred part is only when there is something more sacred that was committed. So what is that? Now, in general, when we say لا يحل دم امرئ مسلم, meaning that every Muslim's life, every single life is actually sacred and has the right to be preserved. All right? Preserving the deen, the nafs, the aql, the ird, the mal. Preserving deen, spirituality, preserving nafs, preserving somebody's life is so sacred that in this hadith, you could see that the Prophet ﷺ had mentioned that somebody's life is so sacred that if anybody transgresses the sacred life, that they would ultimately, or they would lose their right to secure their life because they had committed a major transgression. But here's one thing. Let's move on. إلا بإحدى ثلاث. So there would only be three reasons why the government would have the right to perform prosecution on anybody. Only for three cases only. Well, what are those three cases that allow the government to prosecute? الثيب الزاني. If somebody committed zina and they had a marriage relationship in a valid marriage before. Why? A very common question people ask, isn't that transgressing human freedom? Well, I'm going to take you to a different slide right here, because when we speak about, where is it? Here we go. Nope, here we go. When we speak about sacredness, when we talk about and refer anything to considering it sacred, it's really important to mention a number of things. When we're talking about justice and human rights, yes, you go back to one, who considers and what defines something as sacred. Now remember, in every single government, there are certain things that will be considered sacred. For example, here in the US, considering national security, if somebody is caught committing probably treason against the government, sharing important secret information that the government considers as probably a threat to its security, then the government will have or consider itself having the right that because of espionage that they will be considered for spying or sharing important information that may cause or be a threat, may cause or threat to national security, and therefore that is considered as justified to prosecute that person. Same thing when we're talking about, for example, a serial killer, or when we're talking about certain areas of harm, maybe rapist, etc. There are certain things that the government will consider as a justified reason to commit or to perform some kind of a corporal punishment. Well, before we speak about corporal punishment, you want to remember that the reason why any philosophy, any government will consider that any corporal punishment or prosecution is justified, it is based on what is sacred. So they will regard one area as very sacred, such as here, Homeland Security, as very sacred, and sharing any information or being part or engaging in any way in where you are harming national security is enough to actually deserve prosecution. So what is sacred? Burning the American flag, that's considered sacred, that you can actually get a number of years in prison or even months or etc. in where that is considered sacred. Some while ago, a person burned the pride flag, the LGBT flag, and got 16 years of imprisonment. That was considered sacred. The pride flag is considered sacred. Ironically, the American flag, you won't get as many years as much as you will get for burning the pride flag. And the second part is, who defines what is sacred? Is it the government? Is it the lobbying? Who defines what is sacred? Sacred based on what? And that's why when we look at the basis that you define, the basis that you stand on in order to define something sacred or not, is basically going to determine the type of punishment. It's going to determine the type of punishment and what the type of punishment and how severe it is. And of course, when we look at different countries, they would claim that they are here to support freedom and freedoms and etc. and all those different things. But you want to remember is that no one will say that there's absolute freedom. There's no absolute freedom. Even liberals will regard that LGBT and the rights of the LGBT as sacred and as a sacred issue, and you will be labeled as a homophobe if you consider their behavior immoral. In fact, you can lose your job, you can lose your position, you can lose even the right to probably get certain benefits because you might have an idea or probably consider that LGBT, etc. is immoral. Now, therefore, there's no area, no group whatsoever that will consider that there is absolute freedom. No area, nobody will say that there's absolute freedom. You can't talk about certain things. You can't talk about the Holocaust. You can't talk. You can't deny that, regardless of whether I think it happened or it didn't happen. That's not the issue. But even for those that want to discuss it, there's no freedom to discuss it. There's no freedom to discuss, for example, certain issues. So in this situation, when we talk about what is regarded sacred, it's really important to remember that defining what is sacred is different from Islam compared to modernism or postmodernism. In modernism, what is considered sacred, or at least, for example, for John Locke, he considered, yes, utilitarian, but considered that there are certain things that are so sacred. Why are they sacred? Well, that's because we find it in nature. That in nature, if you don't preserve these rights, that will lead to chaos. Keep the word in mind. It will lead to chaos. What does it mean to lead to chaos? Maybe massive killing, maybe people's rights, people attacking each other, insecurity, etc. And consider that property, consent, and liberty are actually sacred, and that even if there was a voting, an election, or whether people decided that let's do a democratic vote here and decide whether it's okay to consider stealing as illegal. It will never happen. Why? Because property and ownership is so sacred that if you are to consider stealing as legal, that was going to create chaos, and said that you can never whatsoever regard such a thing as legal because of the chaos that it might bring. Keep that in mind. Same thing when we're talking about other groups. Maybe the libertarians considered that, well, what should we talk about? People's bodies, people's pleasures, people's understanding of what life is. These different things are considered sacred. So every single philosopher will define what sacred is. But in Islam, what sacred is actually within these 5 categories. For deen, look at this, you guys, pay attention. For deen, if the person transgresses the limit in deen, what does it mean to transgress the limit in deen? Transgress the limit in deen was clarified here, that if the person was part of the Muslim community and later started a group or started bringing in misconceptions on Islam, that they were part of the Muslim community. This is not talking about a Christian or a Jew, but they were part of the Muslims and they had left the faith. They were in the faith and they had now left it. Now, historically speaking, very rare cases, in fact, the cases where the Muslims not necessarily left Islam, but they had a different interpretation on Islam. That's why, for example, the bid'ah al-mukaffira or bid'ah ghair mukaffira, all those different things. In fact, when you look at the bid'ah, the innovations, even if they had a different interpretation, they were not necessarily prosecuted. When were they prosecuted? When the judge that looks into that matter gives them what is called al-istitaba. What is al-istitaba? The scholars will sit with this person, explain the misconception, and give him some time to overthink it and rethink all the different misconceptions that this person fell into. But then, if they continue, so why is it that they will lose the right to preserve their life? Well, in Islam, you want to remember that every single country is founded on a certain principle. Take, for example, the U.S. There's a certain, the founding fathers put in the different amendments, and the amendments where they basically, act as the main constitution, that we the people, we turn that, etc., and democracy, and therefore just to say that you're communist right on the spot, you're considered a threat to the U.S., and you might even lose your citizenship because you said that you were a communist. To be a communist actually, or a Marxist or a Nazi, you will lose your citizenship. You will lose, well, at least right now during the Trump era, you won't lose your citizenship for being a Nazi. You will actually be probably getting a green card to move into different things and even get some privileges. But with the white privilege, of course, coming in. But when we're talking about that founding idea, that founding principle, that founding value, every single country will have that as considered sacred. So in Islam, the idea of the deen, which makes the dawla, which makes the government, the idea of deen, once that person transgresses and starts attacking the foundation that made this country and the basis that this country is founded upon, that's when they will get istitaba. They will get a time to rethink. The scholars will sit with them, clarify those different issues, but then it will be considered as the person has committed a major treason by leaving the deen. Just as a person who might be a citizen within a country might then commit, because the country might consider national security as the most sacred part. In Islam, it's not the national security is not the most sacred part, but the foundation of that country, which is the deen, is the most sacred part. What is the evidence? The evidence is when the Sahabi, who was actually one of al-Badriyin, who was actually one of the people that participated in the Battle of Badr, the Prophet ﷺ, whenever he would go to a battle, he would not use the right route, let's say it that way, to go to the battle in order to deceive the enemies and go to a different route and then head to wherever is needed. So, the Sahabi, Mistah ibn Athala. Mistah, he basically put a note. I think I'm confusing the name. Put the note and gave a note to an older woman, and the note was supposed to be going to the people of Quraysh. The Prophet ﷺ said, nobody tell anybody or give any message. We don't want the people of Quraysh to know that we're coming. That Sahabi, he gave the note that said that they were heading to Quraysh. The Prophet ﷺ, Jibreel came to him and told him that somebody sent a note, and the note is on its way, and there's a woman that's dressed in such clothing, and there's an older woman that has this note. Go and get it. So the Prophet ﷺ sends the Sahaba to get the note, but the woman insisted that, no, I don't have the note. I don't have anything. So then that's when they said, give us the note or we'll undress. Look at this, ya Allah. This woman is kafir, all right? This woman is kafira. She did not want to get undressed. She did not want them to reduce from her clothing, even though she was not Muslim. Look at this, Muslim sisters, wallahi al-azim. She was not Muslim, and she was afraid that that they will rip off her clothes. She was concerned about her modesty. She was a kafira woman. It's so sad how sisters right now are so lavish and so careless about their hijab. So she said, okay, I'll take it out. And she took out the note and gave it to Ali ibn Abi Talib. They got to the Prophet ﷺ. They took the note, and the note was saying, they're heading your way. So the Prophet ﷺ said, why would you do such a thing? Umar ibn al-Khattab says, Ya Rasulullah, why don't I just, slit his throat? And the Prophet ﷺ said, Shahida Badran. This man was actually in Badr. How do you know? Maybe Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala witnessed and saw all the people in Badr and said to them, If'alu ma shi'tum, do whatever you do, because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had forgiven all the sins that you will commit, even the future sins. Now, did this person commit a treason on the Prophet ﷺ and on the government? Practically, yes. He was caught. The Prophet ﷺ did say he was from Ahl Badr, but the Prophet ﷺ didn't kill him. Was it because he was from Ahl Badr, or was it because he or was it because that it was a political treason? Differences of opinions. But in general, political treason is a lot less dangerous in Islam than a religious treason, which is attacking or harming the foundation that that government is based on, that country is based on, which is a Muslim country and its deen. All right, let's move forward. So just as any other government will consider its foundation as sacred, if you dare attack, for example, the here in America, for example, you attack the foundation and you even consider democracy is not fair, etc., you can right there be considered that you're not Western enough, you're not American enough, you're not patriotic, all these different things, because that's considered as this is the area of something sacred. But in Islam, the area of sacred, the area that is sacred is basically the deen. Let's go for the second part, which is the nafs. So in nafs, right there, when we're talking about nafs, the hadith actually makes it clear that the area that is sacred in this situation is basically the people's life. So if anybody was going to transgress the limit and attack somebody's nafs, but there are different things, DNA, sorry about that. If anybody is to attack anybody's nafs, that's when they will lose their sacred right, which is their nafs, and actually get prosecuted for losing that. Yet, it is important to mention that for any crime to be committed, it must be free from three major things. Number one, that there was no, that the person himself was baligh, that the person has reached the age of puberty. In Islam, if you reach the age of puberty, you're considered an adult. Two, that the person is aqil, that the person is aware, that the person is understanding, able to comprehend, understands the consequences, understands what they're doing, understands, and of course, free from any compulsion, that the person was not under any form of what is called ikrah. What is ikrah? Ikrah is compulsion, in where you are free from anybody threatening you, threatening your life, threatening your body, threatening your wealth, threatening anything that is related to you. So any form of threat is considered an obstacle in a shubha. And this is important to say that in Islam, we are not eager to prosecute or punish anybody. The Prophet ﷺ actually says, "Idra'ul hududa bishubuhat." Keep away, or the shubha which is doubt. Find reason to doubt any of those sides, any of those points, and to give doubt to that person that committed this by looking for, let's say, reasonable, considerable areas in order to not implement the punishment on that person. Idra'ul hududa, meaning that find or stay away from or keep away from implementing punishments by looking for areas of doubt. The area of doubt can be in probably their bulugh. Maybe they didn't reach the age of puberty. Maybe they didn't understand something. Maybe they thought of something. Maybe there was a confusion on something. Or maybe al-ikrah, maybe they were forced into something. Maybe they thought that they were forced. Maybe they had some kind of a mental disability. All those different things, we'll be looking for them in where we will have them sit. They will be asked to sit with specialists in psychology, with specialists, doctors, etc., to make sure that they are fully aware, fully free, and have reached the age of puberty, and that they were vulnerable, not vulnerable, but full aware adults of what they are doing. So in situations where they attack somebody's life, that's when we would look into three different matters. Not always if somebody kills, and not always that they will be killed, because there is going to be a study where we're going to see, did this person kill? Did this person kill amdan? Did this person kill on purpose? Meaning they did it full determination. They set everything. They put all the different sides to it. All right, all the different sides to it. They determined. In other words, it's a very set plan, etc. Then that in that situation, that would be something that is considered amd and a first degree killing, and therefore they will be prosecuted for that. But even that, there will be a number of issues that we'll consider. So just hang on. The other one is shibh amd, pseudo purpose, meaning what? They did have a knife, they did set a determination, but they didn't really mean to kill. They just, yes, they set everything up. They wanted to do a prank. They didn't really intend to kill, but the prank just went wrong. This is just a scenario. The prank just went wrong, and unfortunately, the person gets killed. They wanted to do a prank, but they had a knife, and they wanted to, it just goes wrong. But in the end, there was a knife. They did want to do some pain, but the pain went into killing the person. Is that al-khata, or is that al-amd? Is that by mistake, or is that on purpose? Well, that's when the scholars will evaluate the situation and see whether that was by mistake or whether that was they actually intended to harm, but they didn't really mean that it would go into killing. All right, that's when they'll evaluate those two. So in situations of killing, we will also look at a number of other issues. Number one, the family. The family does have the right to ask for the prosecution of that person, or they can ask for blood money. Blood money, which is what is called a diya. They can ask for a diya. The person, the killer himself, must fast for 2 months. As for the blood money, who pays for the blood money? If he killed on purpose, then he has to pay the blood money. If it was by mistake, it is the family that supports him and gives the blood money, shares shares the amount and collects it. The family, the extended family. That's why not always is tribalism is not always a negative thing. Sometimes it's even to support in order to compensate the family, the other family that lost their son for their loss. Now, the other part, which is the most, of course, I would say, sensitive issue, is the issue of a thayyib az-zani. That's why I left it to the last. A thayyib az-zani. In general, zina is haram. But isn't it personal freedom? In Islam, sexual relation is not personal freedom. In Islam, sexual relation, whether who you're doing it with, is it your wife, your husband, your spouse? And when are you doing it? Is it during the day of Ramadan? How are you doing it? Are you doing it in the area outside of the area that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala permitted sexual relations to be done through? And when we say how, when, and who, is it male, female? Is it somebody that is not halal onto you to get married to? Those areas, Islam considers that as a very sensitive issue because it relates to one, which is the foundation. Just as the country, the government has a foundation built on deen, the Islam, the foundation in this situation, that the other side that the country is founded on is basically family. So Islam considers family is so sacred that transgressing the limit and performing any sexual activity outside of the designated areas that in the who, where, why, when, etc., that Islam considers it as halal, is an issue that the government will then intervene and say, wait a minute, the foundation of our country, which is based on deen and family, is so sacred that the government will intervene and say, wait a minute, are you here committing an actual zina? Or how severe is the punishment and who is committing it? Now, it's very important to keep in mind that a thayyib, a person that has a marriage experience, is going to be, if they had committed zina, because they have a marriage experience, the barrier between them and that sin is a lot less than a person that never had a marriage experience. Why? Because a person that never had a marriage experience, their lust to sexuality is not the same as somebody that had an experience. For those that are not married, for example, if I were to tell you a dish, let me call the dish mulukhiyya, all right? And I said, you know, mulukhiyya is so delicious, you will not crave it. Why? Because you never tasted it. But if you had an experience and you actually tasted that dish, you will crave it. Now, same thing. There are certain things in our mind, that in our brain, that can make certain things, certain items desirable to us only if we had an experience with it. It becomes more of a, what do they call, addicting. There's that addicting side to it, in where your mind will be addicted to it. And that is why in Islam, to bring about that tarbiyah, to bring about that discipline, if the barrier is reduced, the barrier meaning the normal natural barrier, if somebody never had a marriage experience, there's still that natural barrier where they don't really crave it as another person that had an experience. So in that situation, Islam will reduce the punishment. Islam will reduce the punishment. So if somebody has not been married before, they will get 100 lashes. They will get 100 lashes, male or female. But if somebody had a marriage experience before, Islam, because of that sacredness, of that family sacredness, like we were talking about, the foundation of our government, the foundation of any community is deen, nas, aql, udman. Because of the sacredness of family and the foundation of family, Islam will elevate in the situation where the person has a marriage experience, less barrier, more addicting, then Islam will will increase, not reduce, but will increase the punishment. And for Thayyib Zani, the punishment is stoning. The punishment is stoning. Now, stoning, what does that mean? That the punishment is stoning till death. They would open a hole in the ground, and they will be standing in that hole, and then the Muslims would actually stone them till they actually die. The Prophet ﷺ performed that, and in fact, stoning was not a punishment that was invented by Muslims. Stoning was actually a punishment that was even mentioned even in the Old Testament. And the punishment of stoning in the Old Testament was prescribed for 18 different transgressions, 18 different sins. In Islam, it's only for Thayyib Zani, period. It's only in one case, for Thayyib Zani only. In Leviticus, it will raise them. In Leviticus, in the Old Testament, it will raise them up to 18 different situations. But here's a question. Why is corporal punishment even allowed? Isn't it transgressing human rights? Well, you want to keep in mind a number of things. Is that when we speak about human rights, in every single government, they will consider that sacredness of human rights as losing its sacredness, or that sacred element to it, once it brings in a harm or a threat to the community or to a larger group, and which is very important to mention, because when we speak about المصلحة العامة مقدمة على المصلحة الخاصة in fiqh, when we say in fiqh, that would mean that what we read, what the scholars have read from the maxims in the Quran and in the Sunnah, they came to derive a general legal maxim in the religion, a general legal maxim, which is al-maslaha al-amma muqaddama ala al-maslaha al-khassa, which in this situation, al-maslaha al-amma, meaning the general community security and the sacredness that makes that foundation, the security of the deen, the nafs, the aql, the ird, the mal, etc., the general community having their rights not transgressed and preserving their rights is more and prior to a personal individual security. This is the opposite of liberalism. Total opposite of liberalism. In liberalism, no, it's the individual. It's the individual's freedom that is considered sacred and not necessarily the community. But even though they didn't actually necessarily practice that when we're talking about many rules and laws. So when we're talking about traffic laws, they won't consider that, oh, well, I've got the freedom to, drive and go and pass a red light. Why? Because they will consider that, no, in general, we're going to put these traffic laws, even if it curtails your freedom, your personal, individual freedom, because there is a community's life in danger. We need to organize and regulate. We need to regulate people's behaviors in order to make sure that people's lives are sacred, that people's rights are sacred. So in Islam, what is sacred and why is it, when is it permissible for that individual? When does that individual lose their right to preserve their life? Once they transgress a community sacred area. So once they transgress a community sacred area, that's when the government will say, sorry, but your individual right to have your life preserved is currently going to be taken away from you because you had caused a general threat to the foundation within that community, which is their deen or their nafs, or even their or even in situations where it may even be the right to preserve one's body. So when we say the right to preserve one's body, we're actually talking about in the situation, sorry about that, I'm not sure what happened, but just give me a second. So when we're talking about the preserving the, okay, here we go. Preserving that the sacred elements that every single individual, which is human rights, has, we're going to put it in the perspective of al-maslaha al-amma muqaddama ala al-maslaha al-khassa. Al-maslaha al-amma, the community's rights to preserve those elements, the deen, the nafs, the aql, the ird, the mal, which is life, deen, which is the religion, the foundation, the religion, the spirituality, people's lives, people's minds, people's chastity and family, and people's wealth. Now, the higher you go up in this acronym right here, the severer the punishment is going to be. Let's just see it right here. All right. So when we look DNAIM, all right, let's look at wealth. All right. For this, if somebody transgressed the limits in people's wealth, then we're going to look at the severer the crime, the severer you go this way, the severer the crime. So let's see in wealth. In wealth, if you transgress the limits on the community, in where, for example, you get a gun or a machine gun, and you start telling people, give me your money or I'll shoot everybody that's in front of me in this, in this mall. All right? That is not equal to somebody that went into somebody's house, stole a TV and got out. Or maybe even stole all their money, $1 million. All right? I don't know what $1 million is doing in their home, but all right. So in this situation, that the person that transgressed the limit and got a machine gun and was harming these people, this is called al-haraba. This is called al-haraba, in where they will be facing corporal punishment, which is body punishment, in where their left arm or their right arm will be amputated, and they will live left arm, right arm. So basically the opposite. If it's right arm, if it's right or left arm, or it's this one and this one. So it's the opposite. Because they were attacking, and even though they didn't kill anybody, but this is an act where if it becomes more than one person doing it, well, this can bring about insecurity to all the people's lives and everyone in the country. If the person just saraqa min al-hirs, what is that, saraqa min al-hirs? Saraqa min al-hirs, they go, it's an area where it doesn't belong to you, but you go secretly, you steal from their home, etc. This is when their arm would get amputated. Now in Islam, now you want to keep in mind is that when we speak about human rights, it's very important to understand that what determines human rights is based on what determines what is sacred. How sacred is it? So when we discuss anything sacred, that's why even in the US, even in the Western countries, they give lethal injections. They would the electrocuting chairs, the electric chair, etc. All these different ways are methods that are presented as if they are the merciful way of prosecuting somebody. How do we know if that is merciful than doing it in another way, which is just one final killing, and that's basically it? How do we know? Did we go through any of them? We didn't go through any of them. So to us, we just think it looks merciful, and it looks, the person's sitting down on a chair, so I guess they're happy. Seriously? Or a lethal injection, well, we just gave a mosquito bite. That was it. We just put them in the veins. You don't really know what that person's going through. So to picture it and present it as if it was a merciful way of doing it is many times just trying to present whatever those groups wanted to appear and convince themselves that we're just being merciful. Yes, we are attacking somebody's life here. We are taking their life away, but we're just having them sit on a chair. We're just giving them, just a little medicine inside their vein in order to end their life. And that medicine is going to, go inside their heart, probably collapse their heart and have them go through all that. But we're really nice. We just gave it to them in an injection. Yeah, it's lethal, but hey, see, a lot of times we don't realize the narrative that it's being presented in, but we just happen to fall for the narrative. Let's go further. For the ird, remember, then we're for the ird, which is zina in this situation, if the person committed zina, and then we're going to look at who. If the person was never married, then it's 100 lashes. If the person has a marriage experience, then it's stoning. Then we go for the aql. That aql, if somebody intoxicates the aql, which is drinking in this situation, okay, or drugs, in that situation, that punishment is going to lead, and most scholars, they actually had differences of opinions between 40 to 80 lashes, differences of opinions. And of course, then we can go into what is called ta'zir. What is ta'zir? Ta'zir is different than al-hadd or al-qasas, because al-hadd and al-qasas, there's a certain limit that is indicated in the Quran or Sunnah, but al-ta'zir, that's left for the judge to evaluate the situation and set a punishment. It could be imprisonment, it could be lashes, it could be a fine, it could be community service, it could be different things that scholars will discuss. The other part, which is nafs. So in case of nafs, yes, i'tida ala nafs, or somebody killing somebody, that would simply mean that the person loses their right, and that's when the government will intervene and along with the family of the deceased, to actually decide whether it is to kill that person or prosecute that person, basically, or whether it is to forgive him and let go. I one time watched a video where in Saudi, the man, that's it, the government had decided, and the family insisted that this person is going to get the punishment of basically killing. And everybody was standing in public, and it was time. That's it. Everybody is there. This man is tied up. That's it. They're going to kill this man. And the person, the judge that was sitting there, was asking the family the final question: are you going to let go and forgive this person? Just when they're about to make the final hit, the family says, yes, we forgive. Ya Allah, the happiness on that man's face, on that man, is unbelievable. It's like you're getting back to life again. So, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala even encourages that people would forgive and, give a chance. But in the end is that there are certain things. We don't live in a world of angels, and preserving people's rights, and there are certain things that are sacred. There are certain things that are sacred and must be held sacred, or else, just as John Locke considered certain things sacred, and no matter what voting you do, and no matter what type of lobbying you do, in the end, if you do not regard those things as sacred, then the conclusion and the result is going to lead to chaos. And that's why when we look at zina, for example, or even any of those LGBT, etc., in Islam, it is considered as if you are transgressing the limit against the foundation of a country, the foundation of family, the foundation that makes us human beings. Even if it were to be practiced, or what Kant had considered it as a universal maxim, if this was going to be universally practiced, not only individuals, but if this was going to be universally practiced, then it would bring about a chaos. It would be an end to humanity, etc. Well, they can evaluate things that way, but subhanallah, when we look at the rulings of Islam, the way that they're presented is that they are brutal, they are against human rights, etc. Please remember that at many times, a lot of the postmodernists, a lot of the philosophers especially postmodernists and different philosophers, Muslims don't realize that those philosophies are still within the perimeter of human thinking, human understanding, human as with all the faults that can be, with the selfishness, with all the different things that are in it. It is not infallible. It is not infallible. You can talk about the different philosophies of ethics and the different philosophies out there. They will keep changing because they will realize that they are still human. They are still human, and they cannot separate themselves away from the human weakness and the human mistakes that will still be a part of what we are and be a part of our own creation. We are human. No matter, in order to make any legislature, you need the data. You need the full data of what is human, what is the consequence if this was to be practiced on a universal scale, or if this was to be practiced by everyone, etc., which is universal scale, or if this was practiced in the long term, what will happen? What will it lead to? What will the consequences be if we're talking about, for example, single parents, or we're talking about pedophilia, or we're talking about LGBT, all these different things? What are the results? What is going to happen? I see all the time Muslims right now speaking of and afraid to defend Islam, afraid to say that no, these things are not permitted in Islam. These things are an actual assault against the foundation of family in Islam, the foundation of what makes humanity, what makes humanhood in Islam. Stand up, be confident in your Islam. All that they are presenting is just human philosophy, is just human perspective. Why are you afraid to defend a divine decree? Don't be weak and stand strong. Don't be weak and stand strong. Even if they present it in a narrative where it is freedom, it is consent, it is giving people the right, and etc. It's not giving people the right. It's attacking people's rights. It's attacking the foundation of every single person is the right to have a mother and a father. That's a basic God-given right. That's a basic God-given natural right that God Almighty had given every single person. The right to have a father, the right to have a mother, the right to have a family, to embrace them. Now we're actually seeing the rise of depression, and the rise of anxiety, and the rise and the escalation of all those different mental disorders, and the rise of all those different crimes, etc. Because if the person from the very early childhood did not have a stable family, did not find the affection, how are you expecting them to give affection and be merciful on the community when they didn't even have any affection during their early childhood? Simple as that. Simple as that. And that is what we actually have to always be strong and confident in. Don't weaken because the narrative that is presented to you is looking and seeming like it is pro-human rights, pro-freedom, pro-tolerance. This is just a narrative. Many times, same thing with feminism. They will basically bring you all these stories, women crying on stage and women, etc. And look, me too, and all these different things. Look, she's... How do you prove that this really is that this really is true? Not because we have a story. We tend to get emotional on different cases. So they would bring in these different cases and tell you, well, look at this. A woman, because she went through abortion, she was able to get an education. What does that mean? Trying to put in a narrative, trying to work on what is the word? Convincing you through emotions. You don't convince through emotions. You convince through mind, not through emotions. But then the narrative many times is being presented by bringing in emotions. Look, this woman, because she found somebody to do her an abortion, she was able to get an education. That's the narrative that is presented, that if you don't support abortion, you are then, this is how it's presented, you are then supporting women not to get an education. How is that related to that? This is not related to that. And these rare circumstances are then implemented as if, and then presented as if they are supposed to be the law that everyone is abiding by. A law is not supposed to be based on those rare circumstances or rare situations, and education is not based on abortion. But then it is presented in order to give you that narrative that is playing on your emotions, and then you get Muslims even saying that yes, Islam supports abortion, whether it's Han Umar or whether it's Linda Sarsour coming up with their hijab, and yeah, we want to defend that. And then you talk to them, how can you say such a thing? And they will basically tell you, well, there are instances in Islam that are considered as permissible. But those people are not talking about those rare cases where a woman is about to, get a baby that is, that is going to die, etc. That's not what they're discussing. They're discussing to make it as a default right, as a right by itself. That's what they're discussing. And unfortunately, many times we're seeing people hurrying just to support a narrative without looking at what does Islam say about this? What does Islam say about this? What is the ruling in Islam? You can't separate it. You cannot separate it from the legislature. You can't separate it from the practices and the behaviors and the effects that they will have on the people in general and even on a world and a global scale. Any questions? Sorry I spoke too much today, but I thought it was very important because many Muslims are so shy, are so, what is the word that I could use? They lose their confidence whenever this hadith is brought up, and they're always, trying to run away, to bring about a different interpretation, just to run away from speaking about these matters, because they're afraid that they will be labeled as anti-human right, etc. No, this is, in fact, Ibn Hajar al-Haytami, a major scholar, he said this is actually one of the foundations, and a major qaida, like a major qaida, meaning not qaida, the political group, but qaida meaning the major, a rule, a general rule, and a very important general rule, because it relates to sacred foundations to any society, the sacred foundations to bring about stability in any country, stability in any governance, is that you need to make sure that people's spirituality and deen and people's lives and people's minds and people's family and what makes a family and people's property is all respected. And even if somebody transgresses this, we may even, as a government, and this is really important, it is the government that performs a punishment and not individuals. It's the government that takes place by looking at the circumstances, looking at the situation, looking at and evaluates all the different sides in the crime in order to finally make a final judgment based on understanding the situation. And this is the final thing. If there's any questions, I'd be happy to answer them. By the way, I forgot to mention one thing, is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَلَا تَقْتُلُوا النَّفْسَ الَّتِي حَرَّمَ اللَّهُ إِلَّا بِالْحَقِّ, and do not kill any soul unless Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had do not kill any soul, the soul that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had forbid you from killing, unless there was illa bilhaq, meaning that there's an exception, unless there was a justifiable reason. And this is, and right here in this hadith, that would be the justifiable reasons to an exception to the general rule mentioned in the ayah. Any questions before we leave, inshallah? Fatima, so let me just, okay, go ahead, Fatima. I believe you're able to unmute yourself.
Yes, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullah.
So, speaking of, people who are perhaps, let's say, the politicians, Muslim people who are in the media, or maybe non-Muslims for that matter. Let's take Obama, for example, who some people would say was a good president. However, he supported the gay rights for people to get married and all of that. So if something like this, it's something really heavy. Just like right now, the political season, people say, well, the Democrats support gay marriage while the Republicans not quite. So when we put on the scale of good and bad, I guess, I know you have talked about this before, there's so many things people do that are good or support that are good, and so many things that people support that are bad. How should we, as people who are trying to follow and do the right thing, how should we weigh these options that we have and these choices that we have to make?
Very important question. So Fatima, a number of things to say. Number one is that there should be within the Muslim community some leaders that are specialized, and we're not here, unfortunately, within the Muslim community. There's a lot of, I would say, laymen, and just mobilizing groups without even having the ilm to do so. So they are just laymen, and unfortunately, a lot of times, it's all about mobilizing, and it's all about who speaks louder. In Islam, that's not the case. There has to be wisdom. There has to be leaders. The leaders are not necessarily those that just happen to be, good in making eloquent speeches. This is not leadership. Leadership in Islam is based that the person has the ilm to evaluate from the Islamic side what Islam's maslaha, meaning the benefit, and where it goes. Are we talking about the maslaha here? Are we talking about by evaluating the candidates? How are we going to evaluate the candidates? Can we sit with them? Can we talk to them? Now, who and what does the leader do? So we need to have leaders in those that are political science leaders, or at least those that have the ilm in political science, and also al-ilm al-shar'i, and also the ilm in Islamic studies, in order to evaluate what is the priority in Islam. Let's give an example. Right now, we're always talking about either Palestine or we're talking about LGBT. All right. Unfortunately, we are seeing that a lot of the Muslims are actually considering that Palestine is a more important and a more sensitive issue than LGBT, when the opposite is actually true. LGBT is a more dangerous issue than Palestine issue. Why? Because that is a foundation. Remember, when we're looking at DNAIM, the issue of ird, the issue of the foundation of family here in the US, and the akhlaq itself is a lot more sensitive and a lot more sacred than a city called than Palestine. Palestine, you're transgressing there, but when you transgress the foundation of a sacred issue, which is here, foundation of family, that is a lot more sacred than Palestine. But right now, we're seeing people, going into gay parades, and at the same time, very strong in speaking about or against Zionism. So you were strong in speaking against Zionism. So why did you weaken to speak about LGBT, that this is harming the foundation of family? See, sometimes we have Muslims that use more of a political narrative. They got so used to speaking about Palestine. I'm not saying Palestine is not an issue. Remember, I'm Palestiniya here. So the last person to accuse of lacking patriotism and the last person to accuse of not loving Palestine is me. I was actually, at one point in my life, I was doing a lot of political activism, but then I decided to leave that. But when we're talking about weighing those things, it's really important when we look at maslaha, what is the priority? The priority, and keeping in mind also the political science aspect of it, in where can we necessarily ask for that now? What are the different ways in order to mobilize teamwork, to mobilize cooperative, to have the Muslim community understand the situation and what is the maslaha, what is the wisest thing to do in these situations, and then have that ilm, evaluating the situation, and then finally coming to a final understanding and a final decision on what should we be doing. What should we be doing? Should we mobilize the community to do certain things? We're right now, many times we're such in a hurry to vote for the DNC, but not realizing that, there are certain things that we need to really review. I'm not saying go support the Republicans for sure. And I'm not saying don't support the DNC for sure. But I'll tell you, there are certain things that we need to review. There are certain things that we need to review before we rush. And we are seeing a lot of Muslims right away actually saying they're democratic, they're running for the DNC, and they don't realize that there is that package in where you are part of it, and then you will eventually start thinking and using that language that, yes, we support gay rights, yes, we support abortion, yes, we support these things, yes, we are anti-gun. So you are so anti-gun, but you supported abortion? You could see that we're being indoctrinated because the liberals or the DNC is going towards that type of an argument, that the Muslims themselves think that, yes, this makes more sense. Are you using the DNC perspective, the liberal perspective, over the Islamic perspective? So you are pro-abortion, but you're anti-gun? And you're with gun control, and you're anti, all these different things, and so you see that crooked perspective. It doesn't it doesn't actually, or let me say, what it reveals is that the Muslims themselves don't realize that they have to, even when they look at the political candidates, when they look at the political situation, that don't get indoctrinated by the political candidates or the political party that you are with. As Muslims, we have our own separate perspective on what is human rights, what is justice, and how to get to it. Unfortunately, the Muslims, when they go onto the boat of DNC or you name it, all of a sudden they embrace everything at whole. They forget all the values that they were standing up for, and then they lose all what they forget about it. And then all of a sudden they start speaking their language. They start using their rhetoric. Why did you lose everything all of a sudden? Where are the values? Where are the principles that you stand for as a Muslim? Did they all of a sudden become DNC? Did they all of a sudden become democratic? Liberal? Why did you all of a sudden absorb all that rhetoric? As a Muslim, there are certain principles that you stand on. It's so sad to see that the Jewish, the Quakers, etc., the Jewish lobby, etc., they stood up for a lot of their principles, but the Muslims easily gave up. They joined the feminist movement. All of a sudden, they become very feminist, speaking about abortion, etc. No. You can't just ride on the wagon and speak of what Islam actually goes against in order to fit in. Don't lose it because you want to fit in. Be careful. So in that situation, we have to always keep that in mind. We have to always keep that in mind, is that you as a Muslim, you are distinctive in your perspective, in how you define justice, how you define human rights, how you define right, wrong, and the tools that you use. Don't get carried away. And many times we can get carried away because, Linda Sarsour is speaking with all that power. I'm a woman from Brooklyn, New York. It doesn't make you qualified to speak on behalf of Islam. It doesn't make you qualified to speak on behalf of Islam and start giving us fatwa on what women should be and what. You're a woman from Brooklyn, New York. Allah yatik al-afiyah. It doesn't make you qualified. But unfortunately, we see a lot of Muslim women and a lot of Muslims, just because of that power to speak. And the Prophet ﷺ says, "Inna min al-bayani la sihra." Some of the eloquence carries within it sihra, delusion. Delusion, not because it sounds powerful and it sounds confident. It doesn't make it haqq. It doesn't make it haqq. We have to be very careful. We have to be very careful in the way we choose. One, the perspective, and two, who we follow as leaders. Be very careful, not because somebody is speaking with full potential or because they speak with full confidence. It does not make them qualified to determine what Islam is and what Islam does not support. Jazakumullah khairan, everybody, and assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. If anybody else wants to add something, I'd be happy to unmute. All right, Jazakumullah khairan. Everybody will see everybody tomorrow. Tafsir. I'm excited. Tafsir is my favorite class.
Jazakallah khairan.
Wa iyyakum. Assalamu alaikum.